Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Inside Injuries podcast for Week 11 of the NFL season. Inside Injuries is where you get the inside edge on injuries all around the NFL, the NBA, and other leagues throughout the year. You can check us out anytime at InsideInjuries.com. You can also find us on Twitter at Inside Injuries. My name is Tim McCullough. I'm your host, and with me, as always, from Inside Injuries is Virginia Zakis. Virginia, how are you today?
Doing well. Just another busy week with lots of injuries to cover.
Yeah, it's been a really big one, and of course, the loss of Cooper Kupp this week is probably the biggest of all, and we're going to start off with him right away. So, in terms of his recovery time, what are we looking at for Kupp? Is he going to be ready for next season?
So he should be ready for the start of the 2019 season. Most players take roughly 9 months to get back on the field and cleared for contact and ready to actually play in a game. The one thing to watch here is based on the way that he went down and his previous MCL injury, there is likely some damage to the MCL. New damage, not what happened with his previous MCL sprain. So that could lengthen his recovery a little bit, or it could cause him to push his surgery back and not get it for another month or so while they wait for the MCL to heal. So that's something to watch if there is MCL damage. We've also been getting this question about whether his ACL tear is related to the MCL sprain he suffered about a month ago. And the answer is yes. There's both a mental and a physical component to this. His knee was likely slightly weaker as his MCL continued to heal. We still showed that he was an elevated injury risk entering week 11. And now then there's also the mental component. If he doesn't fully trust his knee, it's going to affect all of his movements on the field, his cutting, route running. Of course, most ACL tears occur on non-contact plays, which is what happened here. But it really it doesn't take much, unfortunately, whether it's that mental aspect or maybe the muscles in his leg were slightly weaker. The MCL wasn't fully healed, so his knee was weaker. There's probably a lot of different things that played into this. But again, the good news is hopefully we see him back and healthy and ready to go at the start of next season.
Of course, a lot of our listeners are asking who can they pick up to replace Cooper Kupp in their lineups. This is a tough one. Let's start with his teammate, Josh Reynolds. His guy is going to inherit Kupp's job. But aside from one very big game against the Green Bay Packers, in which he had 3 receptions for 42 yards and a pair of touchdowns, he really hasn't done anything else this season to merit use outside of the very deepest of leagues. So while Reynolds is going to inherit Kupp's job, I don't see him inheriting the targets that Kupp was getting. So Brandon Cooks and Robert Woods are both going to get a bump in value, a decent bump in value, because you have to remember that Kupp had 6 touchdowns to lead the team and 40-plus receptions. Well, those receptions and those targets and those touchdowns have to go somewhere. So I see Cooks picking up a few of them, and Woods I especially like to pick up more of the targets, and he may get some chances in the red zone as well. But I don't see anything really going to Reynolds, maybe 2 to 4 targets per game. It's just not going to have any value. So we have to turn to the waiver wire, really, to replace Kupp. And I've got 3 recommendations for you, beginning with Maurice Harris of the Washington Redskins. He had very good weeks in 9 and 10. And Jamison Crowder's status is perpetually up in the air because of injuries. So I think Harris is a good bet to continue getting plenty of targets. But really, he's no more than a flex or wide receiver 3. That's really where you should consider his value. So he's not as valuable as Kupp. And I think really you're not going to find anybody who's got Kupp. Moving forward, week 13 against the Eagles, Harris is a good matchup. The Eagles give up an average of 42.4 fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position, which is the 5th most among all teams. And then in week 16 which is championship week in most fantasy leagues, they've been playing against the Titans, who give up an average of 39.4 fantasy points to wide receivers. And that's ninth most in the NFL. So those 2 weeks, 13 and 16, are going to be excellent for Harris, which makes him a decent guy to have on your bench if you need him. Moving forward, the next recommendation would be Terrell Williams, wide receiver for the Chargers. He also had two big games this season, week 6 and 7, in which he scored 23.9 fantasy points and 17.8 fantasy points, respectively. However, those were his only two games with double-digit fantasy points. But Williams also has some good weeks on the schedule here. Week 13, he's up against the Steelers, and they give up an average of 38.6 fantasy points to wide receivers, and they've given up 11 touchdowns and 1,559 yards to the wide receivers this season. So that's a really good matchup for Williams there in Week 13. And Week 14 against the Bengals is even better. 42.7 fantasy points on average to the wide receiver position. They've also given up 11 touchdowns and 1,761 yards to wide receivers this season, which is the third, and they're the team that have given up the third most fantasy points on average to wide receivers. So that Week 14 matchup against the Bengals is really good as well. So again, Williams is another guy that you might want to roster as a replacement for Kupp. Finally, there's the guy that I like best among what's probably available on your waiver wire, and that's John Ross of the Cincinnati Bengals. He's finally healthy. He's shown flashes of excellence when he's been able to get on the field this season. In his first game back last week, after being out sporadically throughout the season, he had 2 receptions for 39 yards and a score. With A.J. Green's injury status up in the air, Ross has a very high ceiling and could potentially be the most valuable wide receiver among this short list of replacements. He's the guy that I went out and picked up to replace Kupp on my rosters, and I think he's the guy you should pick up as well. So he's my big recommendation. And that's the short list of what's available on waiver wires. If you still have trade options available in your league, a lot of leagues have passed the trade deadline at this point, but if you can still make a trade in your league, that might be the best way to go. All right, moving along. Stephon Diggs, Minnesota Vikings. Is he going to be fully recovered for Week 11, Virginia?
So when he originally suffered this ribs injury, we gave him a 2-week optimal recovery time. He's going to hit that mark ahead of Week 11. So we think he can be plugged back into lineups. His overall injury risk does still remain elevated, so there's a slight bit of concern. But his health performance factor, which is our metric to predict a player's performance based on injuries, is back at above average. It's not quite in that peak category, which is the best it can be, but above average is solid. And for a guy like Diggs that has pretty high upside, it tells us that he can be plugged back into fantasy lineups.
All right, and of course we've had some questions about Diggs' value, not only this week but sort of moving forward. For this week. The Bears have allowed 8 TDs and 1,600 yards to wide receivers and an average of 37.5 fantasy points per game. I think Diggs' value is going to come from the volume. If he gets the targets, 8 to 10 targets is what he typically gets in a game. If he can get that, he'll have decent value, certainly WR2 value. But I think that's sort of his ceiling. I would never expect WR1 from him. We just haven't seen it from him this year. And that's because really it's Adam Thielen who is the number one guy, the clear number one guy. And so, thinking about how Diggs' presence would affect the fantasy value of any of the players on the field. It's really Thielen who benefits the most when Diggs is on the field. Diggs helps to draw attention from defenders. That helps to free Thielen up a bit more. Teams don't like to get beaten deep, and that's what Diggs brings to the table. He's a guy who can get, behind the secondary and take a ball deep and beat you for a touchdown if he gets his hands on something. And teams like to prevent that, so he often draws double coverage, especially when it looks like when the Vikings line up in their three wide receiver set, and it looks like they're going to send him long. So I think it's Thielen who benefits the most. I also think the ground game gets a bit of a bump when Diggs is on the field for the same reason, because he draws defenders. You can only double cover just so many players, without leaving somebody open. So I think that Diggs' presence helps both the ground game and Adam Thielen. And as far as his value the rest of the season, the Vikings have a favorable schedule the rest of the way. No big standout games. There are no teams scheduled on there that give up ridiculous numbers to wide receivers, but they're all sort of middling teams. Teams right in the 14 to 18th ranked area against wide receivers. So it's a fairly favorable schedule going forward. So you have Diggs, I'd hang on to him. I think he's going to be decent the rest of the way as long as he can stay healthy. All right, moving along. Marvin Jones of the Detroit Lions. What is exactly the story with Jones, and what can we kind of expect injury-wise going forward? Is he going to be fully healthy?
So Jones injured his knee last weekend and underwent an MRI and got relatively good news, actually. All ligaments are still intact. There's no damage to the ACL or MCL or anything, but he is dealing with a bone bruise. This is obviously more than just a simple, contusion on the surface. It's an actual bruise to the bone, but right now we're showing that it's pretty minor, and the optimal recovery time is just 2 weeks. It's something that can be painful to play through, but if he plays through it, he's not likely to cause too much additional damage to the knee, whereas if he was playing through a ligament injury, that would be much more difficult and a much higher injury risk. So right now he's an elevated injury risk. His health performance factor is below average. He should sit this week, but if he returns next week, I think his numbers are going to improve pretty quickly. And he should be good to go, again, unless it's a more serious bone bruise than they're indicating. But based on the MRI results, it doesn't sound like this is going to be more than an injury that affects him for more than a couple weeks.
All right, and our listeners are asking, which Lions receivers are worth owning and starting. So in terms of ownership, I certainly think that Marvin Jones is worth owning. And also Galladay. I think Galladay is another guy that's worth owning. So I would keep my hands on these two players if you've got them, or one of them. Anyway, the problem with the Lions really hasn't been the receivers. It's been Matt Stafford. He's been kind of up and down this season. He hasn't been the consistent quarterback that we've seen in past years. And some of this is the revolving door cast of receivers that he's going to play with. The Lions have had some tough matchups this season, and of course we have a whole new management team on the field. They're learning a new offense, which takes time to gel. I mean, teams don't just jump in with a new coach, a new head coach, and a new offensive scheme, and immediately start to produce. So I think there's been some growing pains as far as that's concerned. The thing about Stafford is that he can click at any time. And I think because of that, it's worth hanging on to Galladay and Jones, because if Stafford finally does click, and start producing like he can produce, and cuts down a little bit back on the interceptions. He's got 8 already this season. He hasn't had more than 10 since 2015. He had 10 in each of the last 2 years. He's almost there already, and we've only played 9 games so far. So, if Stafford clicks, we can certainly see some decent production. So for now, I would hang on to Galladay and to Jones. All right, moving forward, Kiki QT, dynamic receiver, but is he ready to come back? And what is the injury risk to him for the rest of the season?
So right now we're showing that if he plays this week, it'll be 1 week too early. But he's one of those players that has been dealing with a hamstring strain since before the season started. And we've already seen with guys like Dalvin Cook, Leonard Fournette, now Randall Cobb, these hamstring strains just don't go away. He didn't play until week 4. He aggravated the injury but kept playing until week 7. And then he now hasn't played since because he made it even worse. His health performance factor is still sitting at below average, so we don't think he's going to play very well. For a receiver like QT, it's really going to affect his speed. It's going to affect his explosiveness, his route running. It's just a really tough injury to play through if it isn't fully recovered. I'll also add that even if he is feeling like he's, back at 100%, he really isn't. He needs to be very careful. They need to ease him back into practice, get in a few limited practices, make sure it's feeling okay, nothing more than just some minor soreness, and then ramp him up to a full practice. So ideally, they would slowly start to work him back this week, and then next week they'd ramp him up to full practice participation. And if that all goes well, no setbacks, play him in week 12. But right now, not smart to play him in week 11, and there's still some risk here going forward.
Our listeners are asking about QT's value when he returns. And really, all I can say about that is, we know he's a dynamic receiver. And when he's on the field and he's healthy, he produces. And they do go to him. They give him the targets. So taking a look at the schedule going forward, he's got a tough matchup in week 12 against the Titans. But from there, it's excellent. They've got the Browns in week 12. Browns in week 13. And then for the fantasy playoffs and championship games, that's weeks 14 through 16, it's the Colts, the Jets, and the Eagles. Now, except for the Colts, all of those teams that I just mentioned, the Browns and the Jets and the Eagles, are all among the top 10 in terms of fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position this season. So they're all excellent matchups for QT, and I would definitely hang on to him like gold for those weeks. So I love QT's value for the rest of the way. All right, moving along, we've got some quick hits for you, and some of these are really key to some fantasy owners, Virginia. So let's talk first about James Conner. We all know he's in the concussion protocol as of late yesterday, still in there. And the team is hopeful that he's going to be able to play this week. But what's inside injuries outlook?
So good news is Conner does not have a history of concussions. He's going to practice today, Wednesday, and they're hopeful that in the next day or two he will clear concussion protocol. And hopefully this won't be one of those situations where we're waiting right up until game time to find out if he's cleared. He also had 3 extra days to recover because they played the Thursday night game, and that certainly helps when recovering from a concussion. But I'll add that right now his injury risk is elevated. Once you've had one concussion, it becomes much easier to get that next head injury. So we need to keep an eye on him, but if he clears concussion protocol, he should be good to go. His injury risk will just continue to be slightly elevated going forward.
All right. And I would just add to that in terms of his value going forward. We all know, we've all heard that Le'Veon Bell, he will not be returning this season. So there's no longer that threat of touches being taken away from Conner as far as that goes. This past week, we did see Samuels get a portion of the touches, but that was primarily because Connor left the game at one point when they thought he might be concussed. So Samuels got some action and his first touchdown this past week. Going forward, the Steelers are not a team that generally shares running back touches. They'll have Samuels in there once in a while to give Connor a breather, but now Connor has played 84.3% of the snaps heading in, as we entered into week 10. So he's going to continue to get the lion's share of the work out of the backfield. If you own James Conner, though, I am highly recommending that you roster Samuels as a handcuff as we head into the playoff and the fantasy playoff weeks. I don't generally preach the handcuff strategy until the playoff weeks when you've got to absolutely be covered, especially with your superstar players. So I would pick up Samuels right away if you can get your hands on him and stash him away and let go of somebody who you rarely or never start and make a spot for Samuels in your roster as a handcuff to Connor, because who knows, another concussion and he could be down for more than a week. And of course, there's always the threat of another type of injury. All right, let's take a look at Chris Carson, Seattle Seahawks. What are his injury, and could he be back in week 11?
Yeah, Carson is just very banged up right now. His hip injury seems to be the biggest concern going forward. It's an injury he battled earlier in the season, seemed to recover from, and then aggravated a few weeks ago. So that's the biggest one to watch. But he's also been listed in the last few weeks with groin and thigh injuries. When a player goes through that many lower body injuries, it's a major red flag. They're likely all related because he's trying to play through one, overcompensates and causes another. His injury risk is very, very high right now. And his health performance factor also is still sitting at below average, which tells me that his injuries are going to prevent him from playing well if he does suit up week 11. It's going to affect everything from his explosiveness, his power, his speed, just really every part of his game. We're showing that the soonest he should return is week 12. So even though it seems like he's going to play week 11, he shouldn't. And from an injury standpoint, he really can't be trusted.
All right, and I don't really have much to add to that. We spoke at length about Chris Carson in last week's podcast, and nothing has really changed since then. Mike Davis is still the guy. I still like Rashad Penny, though. I love that guy. He's got great talent, and I can't understand why Pete Carroll doesn't get him more involved in the game. He did play quite a bit last week for a change, and did put up some decent numbers. But I don't know that that's going to lead to any additional work this week. I really wish it would. Of course, if Davis gets hurt and Carson continues to be banged up, Penny could get his chance. If you've got the roster space to stash him at this point, sure, go ahead. But it's getting to the point where you may not need, you may need that roster spot for something else, and we'll have to let Penny go. But who knows? I would love to see him get more touches. Whether it happens or not is really, it's going to come down to a question of injuries. So we'll have to see going forward. All right, Joey Bosa. What is his injury, and when should he return?
So all we really know is that it's a foot injury. Unfortunately, the team has released very little information, but I have to suspect that there's some sort of a fracture, maybe a stress fracture, hairline fracture going on, or ligament damage that they didn't reveal to us. There's just no way he would have missed this much time if it was just, a mild to moderate sprain or, a bone bruise or something. So I definitely think there's something more serious going on here. I've also read a lot of, criticism that he isn't willing to return before he's 100% healthy. I actually think it's the right decision. They've done okay without him, and foot injuries are so tricky. If he's dealing with something more serious, like I just said, that that can be very easily aggravated, and the minimum recovery time is 8 weeks. Of course, he's past that now, but it can be anywhere from 12 to 16 weeks, depending on what exactly it is. So I'm actually glad that he hasn't played yet if he isn't fully recovered, but I do think there's a decent chance we'll see him in the next few weeks, although his injury risk is elevated right now and likely will stay that way the rest of the season.
Yep. Okay. I don't have anything brilliant to add to Bosa, and we really haven't had any other questions other than about his injuries. I suppose the only thing that really would have any effect if he does return, you're talking about a different defense, and the team will become a lot less reliant on the offense to carry them through games. But I don't see that really has any effect fantasy wise. So let's move on and talk about Sammy Watkins. And is he going to play in Week 11? And are there any lingering concerns about Watkins going forward?
So he says he's going to play Week 11, but it is not a good idea. His injury risk is high right now. He originally got hurt in Week 9 and then missed Week 10. Good news is an MRI ruled out any structural damage, but he is still dealing with a very painful sprain. It's not the same foot he fractured 2 years ago. That's the good news. That was a Jones fracture previously that required 2 surgeries, which was very serious. This one is not anything like that, but foot injuries are still very tough for wide receivers. It'll really slow him down. It'll affect his routes, explosiveness, jumping for the ball, really every aspect of his game. And every little movement puts stress on the foot. So it really won't take much for him to aggravate it. We're showing a healthy to return date around week 13. So it's best if he sits a few more weeks. Doesn't look like he's going to do that. So with that being said, it would not be a surprise at all if he either re-aggravates his foot or suffers another injury because he's trying to play through his foot injury.
All right. And, in terms of Watkins' failing fantasy value, the problem with Watkins really is that, he hasn't been a consistent producer even when he's been healthy on the field. He's had some real dud weeks in here. He's only had 3 games in which he had double-digit fantasy points, and the one most recent one being Week 8 against the Denver Broncos. And we're talking about the Broncos, whose secondary is quite suspect. He had 22.7 fantasy points that week. Aside from that, we're looking at numbers like 6.4 fantasy points, 7.4 fantasy points. I mean, those are killers. Watkins, he's completely matchup dependent, and at this point, TD dependent, really, to produce decent numbers. Schedule-wise, the Chiefs have some very favorable matchups for wide receivers going into playoff weeks, and so Watkins is worth having on hand for those. But whether you're going to start him or not is a tough decision. I've got him in one league, and he's graced my bench all season long. I haven't felt the need or the desire to put him in there. So if it comes down to rostering Watkins or a handcuff for your very valuable running back, I think I would advise you to have that handcuff and let Watkins go. It's really, really tough to depend on him. All right. And that brings us to the close of the Week 11 podcast for Inside Injuries. If you have further questions, we urge you to reach out to us on Twitter. And you can go directly to Inside Injuries at Inside Injuries on Twitter, or you're welcome to send your questions to me at Tim's Tens, and that's TIMSTENZ. Or Virginia, would you please give us your Twitter handle?
At VZakas, ZAKAS.
All right, so that's 3 different places on Twitter where you can reach out to us and put in your questions. Um, InsideInjuries.com is the place where you get the inside edge on injuries around the NFL, the NBA, and other leagues throughout the year. Don't set your lineups until you check InsideInjuries.com every Sunday, where you'll get the latest news right up until game time. And that brings us to a close for the Week 11 podcast for Inside Injuries.